Welcome to the fourth recording of this. This is still in the first part of the book. I hope to finish that today. So thank you. Thanks for all the support for the people who've been listening. Alright, here we go. Also, sorry about the French and some of the pronunciations and all that. Etienne Beret. How quickly it happened. How quickly he changed from the urban young doctor who greeted me with such studied civility every Sunday after Mass. How quickly he became the brightest star in my dark and empty sky. Within a few short weeks it seemed to me that I thought of nothing but him, and that time was measured by the deadly length of hours which separated our secret assignations. For 8 years I had lived like a nun. Perhaps it was inevitable that I should fall in love with the first handsome man to look on me once more with desire. He knew my history, of course. There were only too many eager to relate the grisly details in the hope of sparing a good-looking young man the curse of my kiss. Stubbornly, he ignored the warnings of doom and continued to present himself each Sunday at the end of my pew. I would place my hand upon his sleeve and sweep down the nave, displaying haughty indifference and defiance to those who watched with disapproval. He was younger than I, with firm, well-sculpted features and eyes that were inclined to stare with scorn at people he despised. And he despised most of Boucherville, dismissing its inhabitants as provincial and bigoted. The few patients he had managed to acquire were soon irritated by his arrogant and rather abrasive manner, and his association with me ensured that he added no more to his practice. I myself quickly learned to defer to his opinions, finding our time together too precious to be wasted in argument. I lived in constant fear that he would abandon what he referred to as this tedious little backwater. I returned to do research in Paris. His restless intelligence and intolerant impatience were far better suited to the laboratory than the drawing room of a querulous patient. It was only a question of time before he came to accept that himself. He was insatiably curious about Erik, asking me deep and probing questions and often making notes of my replies. His interest, he assured me, was purely scientific. He wished to build up a case study. Repeatedly he asked to see the child, but that, for many reasons, I would not permit. At the back of my mind, as an uneasy feeling was growing that he would not hesitate to pin Erik to a dissecting table in order to satisfy his curiosity. Madeleine, he chided gently, as I increasingly shied away from his persistent inquiries. You must not be so suspicious of the scientific mind. I thought you trusted me. I looked away. I was growing to love the man, but I did not trust the scientist. I feared the lust for knowledge that lurked like a ravening wolf in his cool blue eyes. Rising from his sofa, I walked away to the window, staring out at the village green and the old church which towered to the sky just beyond. You asked too many questions, I murmured. Of course! He tossed the notebook aside and came to stand beside me, throwing off the impersonal, clinical manner like a solid apron. Insatiable curiosity is not a very attractive quality, I'm afraid. Forgive me, Madeleine. His hand was insistent on my arm, but I did not turn to look at him. Sometimes I think all you want from me is answers, I sighed. He turned me slowly around until I faced him. Not at all, he said, and kissed me. Who is that man? Erik demanded abruptly. He was waiting for me in the hall as I let myself into the house, and there was a hard accusing look in his eyes as he stared at me. Who is that man? He repeated stonily, when I failed to answer. Why does he walk with you alone? It was almost 4 months since I first met Etienne, but I had been very careful that Erik should not see us together. Obviously, tonight I had not been careful enough. If I chose to walk with a man, it is no concern of yours, I retorted angrily. Hanging up my cloak, I made to walk past him, but he blocked my path. to the drawing room, and suddenly I knew a moment of intense fear. He stood as high as my shoulder now, and was deceptively strong in spite of his skeletal frame. "Who is he, Mother?" It was the first time he had ever used the word to address me, and the contempt in his voice was quite terrifying. "His name is Etienne," I found myself saying breathlessly. "Etienne Beret. He is a doctor. Now let me pass, Erik. I will not be questioned in this tiresome and impertinent manner. My voice waved to a halt as he continued to stare at me coldly. "He is a friend," I stammered. "You must understand, Erik, that I have a perfect right to have friends like anyone else in the village." He made a movement toward me, and instinctively I took a defensive step back. "I do not wish this friendship to continue," he told me inexorably. The eyes behind the mask were like gimlets. I had never seen him look at me like this before. I retreated down the hall until I felt my back against the front door, but still he advanced toward me with curious, unchildlike menace. I struck out at him in sudden fear, but after that first hesitant blow, rage overwhelmed my apprehension at his unspoken threat. "You!" I screamed. "You do not wish? How dare you speak to me like this? You ruined my life the day you were born. Ruined it! Ruined it! I hate you. I hate the very sight and sound of you. Your devil's face and your angel's voice. There are plenty of angels in hell. Did you know that? I wish to God you were there with them, where you belong. I wish you were dead. Do you hear me? I wish you were dead." He seemed to shrink, almost shrivel, in front of my eyes. Whatever he might have been a few seconds before, he was only a child now, recoiling in disbelief from a punishment beyond his worst imagination. It was as though all the ugly emotion that had been festering between us since his birth had erupted into a single massive boil and finally burst, drowning us both in its poison. And I knew, as I looked at his crushed misery, that he would carry those words with him to his grave. Nothing I could say or do would ever wash their corrosive stain from his mind. As I hovered beside him, unable to express my grief and remorse, he suddenly took his hands away from the mask and stared at me with a wretchedness that was utterly beyond tears. "I hate you too," he said with slow, pained surprise, as though it was something that had only now been revealed to him. "I hate you too." And turning away from me, he groped his way slowly up the stairs like a blind child. Erik did not speak of the man again. From that time he displayed complete indifference to my increasing absences, not even bothering to look up when I returned to the house. He wrapped around himself a cloak of impenetrable silence and spent most of his time working alone in his room, with only Sasha for company. The dog was growing old and obese, entering the period of rapid decline which beats so many canines around their 10th year. Erik carried her patiently up and down the steep stairs that were now beyond her, bathed her unroomy eyes, and sometimes sat for an hour at a time feeding her by hand. But I was not convinced he understood that the inevitable moment of parting might be close at hand, and since it was not a thing I could comfortably discuss with him, I asked Father Francois to raise the subject instead. Their quiet voices were only just audible to me in the next room, where I sat sewing. "Yes," said Erik calmly. He knew that Sasha was old and would not live forever. Might not perhaps live beyond the next year or so, but he understood that God would take her to live in heaven and they would not be separated forever. I felt, rather than heard, the priest's quick intake of breath, the breath he had taken to correct his pupil's childish but unacceptable error in doctrine. He asked Erik to understand that though God had compassion for all his creatures, it was to man alone that he had granted an afterlife. "Animals," said Father Francois solemnly, "have no souls." There was a heartbeat of silence, and then, without warning, a scream of indescribable grief and rage, which seemed to rip my head apart. I rushed into the drawing room in time to see Erik seize the clock from the mantelpiece and smash it into earth, and then, to my absolute horror, he picked up the cold tongs and lashed out at the priest, shrieking terrible obscenities, words I did not even think he knew. When I tried to get between them, the tongs caught me with full force on my shoulder, slicing clean through the velvet into the flesh. The priest dragged me back out of the range of the wildly flailing weapon, which was hacking indiscriminately at everything in its path. "My God," I breathed. "He will wreck the entire room. Let me stop him." Father Bintoy's answer was to pull me through the door, shutting it hastily behind him. A savage barrage of blows struck the panels in our wake, and the door began to splinter. But as I caught at the handle, the priest snatched my hand away. "You must not approach him. He does not know you." I stared at him in disbelief. The sounds of frenzied destruction continued in the room beyond, and the priest's face was deathly pale, his lips set in a gray line of pain and grief. "I have failed," he muttered wearily. "I have failed him, and I have failed God." "I don't understand you," I gasped. "Are you telling me he's mad?" The priest shook his head grimly. "This is not madness, child, this is possession. If you go to him now, I think he will kill you. You must wait until whatever demon now has him in its grip grows tired of its sport and departs." I looked at the blood soaking steadily into my sleeve. Will that happen again?" I stammered uncertainly. The priest sighed. "Once a suitable host presents itself to the forces of darkness," he spread his hands in a helpless gesture before continuing. "Tomorrow I will perform a ceremony of exorcism," he said unhappily. "Exorcism?" Blackness closed in around me, and Father Francois caught me as I swayed. "Exorcism?" said Anthony in disgust. "That priest is a stupid meddler who probably belongs in the Middle Ages. This is not a case for the church, but for a medical institution." "An asylum," I muttered. "You mean an asylum for the insane?" Etienne sighed. "I wish you would not resort to such emotive terms. The child appears to suffer from a degree of mental disturbance, which, under the circumstances, is really no more than what I would expect to find. There are few things more hazardous to the equilibrium of the human mind than the freakish genius you have described to me." He placed one hand upon my arm before adding quietly, "My darling, you really must begin to give serious thought to the question of an institution." "But they are terrible places, are they not? One hears such dreadful tales of cruelty." "By no means," replied Etienne calmly. "Some are better than others, I won't deny that. But I happen to know of an excellent place where he could be kept out of harm's way. He could have his books and his music. He'd be quite happy. Or at least as happy as he's ever likely to be on this earth." Etienne leaned back on the river bank and watched the Seine flow past through half-closed eyes. He had a brisk, uncompromising manner of dealing with emotion, a manner that negated both passion and sentiment. His boundless optimism was capable of cloaking the most unpleasant proposals in a respectable, acceptable garb. A quick decision, a signature upon the committal papers, and all my problems would be over. He made it sound so easy and so right. Leaning over, he pressed me back against the tussocky grass, and I was glad to surrender to his insistent lips. It meant that I did not have to think, to argue with myself. For a few blissful moments there was only physical delight and spiritual release, and I pulled him closer, fearing the moment when he would draw away. 10 years ago I did not believe that I would have loved him. For 10 years ago I could not have borne to be told what to think and what to do in such a cavalier fashion. Now there was nothing I wanted so much as to be safely locked in his arms and sheltered from the ugliness of reality. We were lovers in all but the fullest sense, for he was too logical, too rational, too sensible to take the risk of ruining me. He craved a respectable existence, in keeping with the dignity of his profession, and I knew that these hole-in-the-corner assignations were likely to pale in time. Not unreasonably, he wanted some promise of a future. But What future could be there when I dared not even invite him for dinner for fear of provoking Erik's violent rage? I knew this state of affairs could not continue indefinitely, and already there was a soft-footed intruder, whispering with insidious determination at the back of my mind, telling me now what I think I had known from the very first moment in the nave of the church. This man would marry you if you were free. If I were free of my misbegotten child. If I put him in an institution for the violently insane. I was very quiet as we walked back along the riverbank, and long before we came in sight of the village I suggested it would be wiser for me to continue alone. People are beginning to talk. In your position, you cannot afford a scandal. He put one arm around my shoulders and tilted my face up to his. Madeleine, he said gently, it doesn't have to be a scandal. You know that, don't you? All I am asking is that you let me examine the boy and give you my professional judgment on his mental state. But I knew that judgment had already been made, and desperate as I was not yet ready to play Judas. You will think about what I have said, he insisted. Yes, I said dully. I will think about it, but I knew that I would not. Etienne was right about the exorcism. It was a thing I should never have permitted. If Erik was not possessed before the ceremony took place, he most certainly behaved as though he was once it was over. His respectful attachment to the priest was gone for good. He refused to continue the vocal training that had given them both such delight. But worse than that, he refused to hear Mass or to have a crucifix in his bedroom. I did not dare to insist, for he had begun to behave so strangely that I found myself growing truly afraid of him. Curious things began to happen in the house when I was near. Articles disappeared, almost before my very eyes, only to return again once I had ceased to search for them. I knew he was responsible. But when I challenged him, he only shrugged and laughed and told me that we must have a ghost. Then one day, when a cup had leapt from its saucer and smashed itself in the grate, I discovered a finely pared length of thread attached to the broken handle, and I turned on him in fury. You did that, didn't you? You made it happen. No, he backed away from me in sudden fear. How could I have done that? I wasn't even near it. It was the ghost. There is no ghost, I shouted. There is no ghost. Only you, with your infernal threads of silk. Look at it. You haven't been so clever this time, have you? This is one trick I can see straight through. He was silent, glaring at the gossamer thread as though his own incompetence angered him. I could almost hear his furious determination that next time there would be nothing to betray his hand. There will not be a next time, I said calmly, and saw his head jerk up in alarm as I should have read his thoughts with such ease. This wickedness is to cease right away. Do you hear me? It isn't me, he repeated with childish stubbornness. It's the ghost. The ghost that Father Minsoir tried to send away. I shook him wildly by the shoulders until the mask dislodged itself and fell to the floor between us. Stop this madness, I shrieked. Stop it at once. If you don't, I shall do what Dr. Bray advises and send you away to that terrible place for mad people. Yes, that frightens you, doesn't it? Well, I'm glad. I'm glad it frightens you, because perhaps it will make you stop this insane behavior. I promise you, Erik, if I send you away to an asylum, you will never come back. Never. They will tie your hands behind your back and shut you away in a dark place until you die, and you will never, never see me again. Now will you stop? Will you? I let go of him abruptly and stood back, panting for breath, while he knelt on the carpet at my feet and replaced the mask hastily with shaking hands. I could feel his terror. It was like a physical force, but for once I felt no guilt nor remorse at my harshness. The two of us were approaching a dangerous precipice, and I knew that if I did not take control of him now, we would both finish in an asylum. What would you do? He whispered softly, not looking at me. If I were no longer here. I would marry Dr. Bray, I said. goaded to the lie by sheer desperation. "He has already asked me, and you are all that prevents the marriage taking place. So you see, you had better take care and do as I say. Now look at me. Look at me and promise there will be no more of these happenings." He continued to kneel on the floor, winding the thread of silk tightly around one skeletal finger until the white tip turned blue where he had cut off circulation of blood. "Erik!" Quick as a grasshopper, he leapt out of my reach and my hand and ran to the door, where he paused to look back at me defiantly. "There is a ghost," he told me steadily. "There is a ghost here, Mother, and it's going to stay with you forever and ever." I stood looking after him, one hand against my throat and the other outstretched to him in a hopeless gesture of supplication. I suddenly felt very cold. That night I heard the voice for the first time, a voice that was familiar and yet strangely altered, singing so low and soft that at first I was barely aware of its sweet hypnotic tone. The voice was close beside me, so close that it seemed if I stretched out a hand I should surely touch it. But as I stood up curiously and moved toward it, the voice retreated before me. I stopped and stared at Erik, who was grooming Sasha on the mat before the fire. He seemed absorbed in a task and quite unaware of my agitation. The voice was muted in distant, eerie breath, which seemed to beckon me out of the room and up the staircase. I followed with helpless fascination, and as I entered my bedroom, the wordless melody seemed to gather strength and center itself upon the statue of a shepherd boy which stood on my marble-topped chest of drawers. I drew closer, and now it was unmistakably clear to me that the statue itself was responsible for the humming. I gazed at it in amazement, and as I did so, I became aware that I was no longer alone in the room. Erik was suddenly beside me, watching me watch the statue. He had removed the mask, and his lips were set in a grim line of silence, and then I knew. I drew back my hand very softly and deliberately, letting him see my intent, but he did not even blink, and the soft seductive humming never faltered. When I struck him across the mouth, it seemed to me that it was the statue that cried out in pain. I understood now how he had employed those long dismal hours of solitude. I recognized a new achievement that he had added to his curious misarray of talents. I remembered the present which Marie had brought him on his 5th birthday, a present which had remained unopened and which I had later locked away in my bureau as totally unsuitable. An antique copy of Le Ventriloquique ou Les Sorry. "I thought it would interest him," she had explained when I took her to task for stupidity. "I only wanted to amuse him. But if you think it best that he should not have it, then of course you must keep it from him." I should have known that nothing could be kept from Erik once his curiosity was aroused. How could I have been stupid enough to think that he would not remember the only birthday present he ever received, or that a simple lock would be sufficient to keep him out of my bureaus? The book was never missing whenever I had cause to open the cabinet, but of course he was too clever and secretive to have made a mistake as elementary as that. If he wished to keep something to himself, there was no one more adroit at covering his own tracks than this curious child, part cat, part fox, part nightingale. The shepherd boy continued to sing to me, and though I understood the secret of this illusion, I found myself compelled to listen to its haunting beauty. At first I listened against my will, swearing each time that I would destroy the wretched figure as soon as it was silent. On several occasions I lifted my hand to dash it to the floor, but each time I was restrained by some unseen force which seems to emanate from deep inside my own body. And then, little by little, I began to abandon my senses to its growing power. I became unable to distinguish between illusion and reality. The voice not only sang now, it talked, and I soon found myself acceding to its numerous little requests. I humored it when it told me it was cold by the window, and moved it to the table beside my bed. And when it sulked like a child and told me it would not sing unless I kissed it, I bent obediently and laid my lips against its cool, lifeless cheek. There was indeed a ghost now, but its spirit was beyond the power of exorcism, and I embraced its presence with wondering delight. Slowly, I was crossing the enticing bridge that had opened up before me, following a magic rainbow which beckoned me ever further into a dangerous unknown land. How much of this was a dream, product of alone repressed emotions, and how much was due to Erik? I cannot say. I was drowning willingly in the quicksand of this growing fantasy, and it seemed to me that physically we drew even farther apart during this time, meeting only in strange spiritual oases of sound. I scarcely saw him, but when I did, he was very restrained and civil, almost quaintly adult in his manner toward me. And as he grew older and more fiercely independent before my very eyes, it seemed to me that the voice of the figure in my room grew correspondingly younger, more petulant and demanding. With every day that passed, increasingly, it seemed to punish me, first with stubborn silence, and then with heartening cry of an inconsolable baby. I cannot eat or sleep. Night after night I walked my room in despair, cradling the statue against my breast, until at last it lay beside me in my bed, silenced only by the touch of my hand. I spiraled farther and farther into this dark dream, until the dominance of this cold porcelain tyrant began to touch every aspect of my life. I no longer went to Mass, and refused to see Father Francois when he came to the house, and when Etienne remarked upon my pallor and my distracted air, we quarreled violently. "What is the matter with you, Madeleine?" he demanded, uncertainly. "You're like a hunted fox, staring over your shoulder all the time. What is it you are listening for?" "Nothing," I said sharply. "I'm not listening for anything." But even as I lay in his arms in a house on the far side of the village, the sound of crying still filled my ears and made me too restless and agitated to respond to all his cares. At length, rebuffed and disturbed by my coldness, he sat up and looked at me with irritation. "If you do not wish to be touched, I would prefer you tell me and exercise in mute frustration." I got up like a sleepwalker and went to the door. Etienne ran after me, and as I looked at him, I could see anger and concern warring on his face. "Tell me what is wrong," he demanded. I shook my head. "I have to go," I said bleakly. "I should not be here. I've left him crying." Etienne frowned slightly. "Erik?" I turned to him impatiently. Why on earth should he think I was talking about Erik when it was the baby who cried? I had opened my mouth to tell him this, when I suddenly remembered the dreadful word asylum and Etienne's brisk, uncompromising sense of logic. If I told him, he would think I was mad. "I don't understand," he persisted, reaching out for me. I avoided his grasp with an urgency that was suddenly very close to fear. All I wanted now was to get out of this house as quickly as possible. "Madeleine!" He cornered me by the door, and his grip on my waist seemed like a jailer's. I began to struggle wildly. "Let me go!" I shouted. "I will not be treated like a specimen for observation at the School of Medicine." He let go of me in astonishment, and I wrenched open the door. "For pity's sake, Madeleine, let us discuss this calmly." "I don't want to discuss anything. I don't want to see you again, Etienne. Ever." I saw the pain and bewilderment on his face. For once he had no words ready, no nice, neat, empirical solutions to offer. Science and logic alike failed him in the face of my devastating unreason. "I can't believe you mean that," he said with disbelief. "What has happened? Madeleine, what has happened to make you turn from me like this?" "Nothing has happened," I told him distantly. "I must go." "You can't go. Not like this. Madeleine!" He caught my hand once more, but I only stared at him unseeingly as the sound of crying swelled in the unbearable crescendo inside my head. I might have been looking at a total stranger. His words were empty mouthings that had lost their power to move me, and at last I saw his arm drop helplessly back to his side. He made no further attempt to stop me leaving, and as I left his house, I was aware that he would be too proud to seek me out against my spoken wish. A few months ago, the prospect of his indifference would have broken my heart. Now I welcomed it with relief. One by one, I was closing the windows that looked out on the world beyond my prison, retreating behind the strange barricade that Erik was patiently erecting around me. The day that I walked away from Etnine was the day that I finally turned my back on reality and locked the door. Curious contentment descended upon me when I finally abandoned myself to the dream and ceased to function with any pretense of sanity. When I accepted that heaven had looked with pity on my plight at last and sent me the perfect, beautiful baby that Charles had promised. When I accepted that I had two sons. One was a monster, a genius of inhuman and terrifying dimensions, but the other was as enchantingly normal as I could ever have wished, and his welfare was my consuming obsession. I could not bear to be departed from him. Strangely, Erik showed no jealousy of this new interloper. At my request, he carried the old cradle down from the attic bedroom. Without a murmur, and watched me caress the carved wood when he had set it beside my bed. "You are happy now," he said quietly. "You don't want to marry Dr. Bray now that you have the baby. You'll have to stay and look after it, won't you?" I nodded dreamily as I bent over the cradle and began to arrange the lace coverlet. After a moment, I remembered to thank him for being so helpful. "If I'm helpful, you won't send me away, will you?" he persisted. "You'll let me stay here with you both?" "Yes," I said vaguely. "I expect so." He gave a little sigh. I could not tell whether of relief or satisfaction. I think he lingered a while watching me. I was not aware of the moment when he slipped silently from the room. When Marie got out of her chair and stared at me, her face was as white as the collar of her gown. I could not think why she would look at me like that. I had merely asked if she would like to look at the baby. She did not reply. She simply went on staring at me, and I wondered, with surprise, if she could possibly be jealous. I watched her grope her way across the room to the piano where Erik sat watching us. "Your mother is very sick," I heard her tell him in a low, strained voice. "I'm going to ask Dr. Bray to come see her at once." "You must not do that," he said steadily. "Mother doesn't like Dr. Bray, and she doesn't want him near here in the house. If you bring him here, I will not let him in." "Erik," she protested helplessly, "you must try to understand that—" "I think you should go now, mademoiselle." His voice cut across her wavering tone with devastating authority, and I saw her stare at him for a moment with a disbelief that bordered on fear. Then abruptly she rushed back to me and began to shake my arm. "Madeleine, listen to me. I'm going to fetch your cloak and take you down into the village at once. I am going—" Her voice broke on a gasp of terror as Erik's long fingers closed around her waist. "I think you should go now," he repeated ominously. "I want you to go." She pulled away from his grasp and steadied herself against the mantelpiece. I saw with vague curiosity that she had begun to cry. "I must tell Dr. Bray," she muttered feverishly to herself. "I must tell him what terrible things are happening under this roof." "She doesn't want him here." I watched her back away as Erik began to walk steadily toward her. "And she doesn't want you either. Interfering, asking questions, you tire her." Marie stopped crying and looked at me as though she could not believe that I made no move to correct this astonishing imprudence. When Erik brought her cloak and handed it to her, she took it from him without another word and followed him from the room like a sleepwalker. "You must not concern yourself," I heard him say calmly as he opened the front door for her. "My mother is quite well, but she does not want visitors any more. Good day, mademoiselle. Thank you for calling." If she made a reply, I did not hear it. I listened instead with a calm indifference to the sound of the key turning in the lock and the bolts sliding into place. At length, he came back into the room and stood beside my chair, looking down on me solicitously. "Shall I play for you?" he asked. "Yes," I said dreamily. "Mozart. The Piano Concerto in C major." He sat down at the piano and began the cadenza, playing from memory with his familiar effortless brilliance, and wrapping me in a warm cocoon of languorous sound that floated me ever farther from reality. I had no thought, no desire, now but to be left alone in a world entirely fashioned and furnished by his imagination. The day drifted, as all my days were beginning to drift, in a calm, unquestioning haze of dependence. All decisions and conscious thought had been taken from me, and I merely a contented spectator able to observe with strange detachment. All day he sat and worked on a series of designs for a building unlike anything I had ever seen before, a building so extraordinary and bizarre that it was only the elevations, front, rear, and side, which made it recognizable to me as a structure at all. I waited patiently for him to finish and began to play for me again, but he was transported by a fierce elemental frenzy of creativity which I dared not disturb. Repeatedly he screwed up sheets of paper and flung them into the fire with angry frustration, and when Sasha whined for attention and pawed at his hand, he picked her up impatiently and shut her outside in the dark garden. That last action was so utterly out of character that it penetrated the stupor of languor which gripped me. In that moment I suddenly saw him as the grown man he would become, totally consumed by his obsessive quest for perfection, formidable and frightening in his ruthless drive to create. He would be 9 this summer, and already he was touched with the awesome, unpredictable majesty of the ancient Greek gods. Time would come, as Father Mitzvah had foreseen, when he no longer acknowledged the barriers that confine and unite the human race. He would be a law unto himself, untroubled by tiresome moral questions of right and wrong, soul entirely lost to God. It was dark when he finally laid his lead down with a sigh of exhausted satisfaction. I saw him glance automatically over to the hearth and check in surprise. "Where's Sasha?" he demanded with concern. "In the garden," I frowned. "Don't you remember, Erik? She was annoying you, and you shouldn't put her out into the garden at night, Mother. It's too cold for her now that she's old." I sat in my chair, tried and condemned by his unwavering certainty, and dimly troubled by this curious lapse of memory. Would he always forget those deeds which he did not wish to remember? Before I could collect myself sufficiently to reply his accusation, the dull whining outside the front door changed to a frenzy of barking as Sasha deserted her patient vigil on the doorstep and rushed to the gate. "Look!" shouted a voice in the road. "There's the monster's dog!" Through the window I caught the glare of lanterns, and a moment later a barrage of stones began to rain in the direction of the gate. When Sasha gave a yelp of pain, Erik leapt to his feet and rushed to the door. But I reached it first. "No!" I screamed. "Don't you see they're trying to lure you out there? They'll kill you if you go out to them. Erik!" The eyes behind the mask were an insane yellow gleam of rage. When he threw me aside with a violence that knocked all the breath from my body, I struck my head on the newel post at the foot of the stairs. For a few moments I was too dazed to do anything except cower on the floor, listening with disbelieving horror to the ugly voices of the mob and Erik's awesome rage. Laughter and shouting, a man's high-pitched scream of pain, Sasha's frenzied barking rising to a crescendo and ending in one long, piteous howl, and then Erik's shriek of demented anguish. "I'll kill you! I'll kill all of you!" Swaying dizzily to my feet, I staggered to the open doorway, but the lanterns were already swaying and bobbing away down the road, driven off by the demonic fury of an outraged child. When Erik struggled back down the paved path with Sasha in his arms, I could see at once, from the unnatural angle of her head, that her neck had been broken by some savage blow. I stretched out my hand to him, but he pushed past me as though I didn't exist. Stunned with shock, I followed him into the kitchen, where I found him kneeling beside the bloody bundle of fur, his thin shoulders shaking with the harsh violence of his sobbing. In the light from the oil lamp, I was able to see that his mask had been torn off in the struggle and his yellow flesh slashed in several places. Blood was trickling into his eyes, and as he lifted a hand to wipe it away, I suddenly caught my breath. The blood on his shirt was not Sasha's, as I had first thought. The stain was growing, welling outward, fed by some unseen knife wound within. An icy coldness gripped me as I laid a trembling hand on his sleeve. "Come away now," I whispered. "There's nothing more you can do for Sasha." "I must bury her," he said with all despair. "I must bury her and sing her requiem." "Can't," I breathed in horror. "She will have a requiem," he sobbed. "A requiem to take her soul to God." "Yes," I said hastily, praying silently that I would be forgiven for condemning this blasphemy. "But not tonight. You've been stabbed, Erik. Don't you realize that? You must not come and rest while I attend to the wound." "I must bury her," he repeated, as though he had not heard a word I had spoken. He swayed to his feet, and though the red stain on his shirt spread alarmingly, I knew that I could not prevent him. Wounded and broken with grief, he was still stronger than I, still capable of throwing me across the room if I resisted his determination. Lifting down a lantern, I lit his way into the orchard at the back of the house without another word. I wept as I watched him struggling to dig a grave in the iron-hard soil. He would not permit me to help, and I crouched on the grass beside Sasha's slowly stiffening body, stroking the matted fur and wincing at the labored sound of his every breath, listening to the trembling notes of the Dies Irae. I closed my eyes and clung to the crucifix around my neck. "Forgive him, Father. Forgive him. He is only an angry child. He does not understand how he sins." When it was done, Erik stumbled back to the house and collapsed on the sofa in the drawing room. I ripped open the sodden shirt, but there was so much blood that I could not immediately locate the site of the wound, and I felt a panic closing in around me. "Madeleine!" I turned with relief to find Etienne standing in the open doorway, his hat in one hand and his bag in the other. In a single stride he seemed to be beside me, bending over the sofa in alarm. "Who did this?" he demanded with cold fury. "I don't know. There was a crowd. Men, boys. They killed the dog. He struggled with them and... Oh God, Etienne, is it serious?" He frowned as he probed the wound with expert fingers. "It's missed a lung. He's been very lucky. Heat some water, would you? And bring some salt." I did as I was told and returned to watch anxiously as Etienne worked on my son with deft efficiency. He was very calm, and there was no indication in his manner that this patient differed in any respect from his others. Erik lay very still, watching him with guarded hostility. "Are you Dr. Ere?" he demanded wearily. Etienne smiled briefly in acknowledgement. "Why are you helping me?" "I am a doctor," said Etienne with a gentle patience that quite took me by surprise. "It is my duty to help those who require my skills. You have been a very brave boy, Erik. I'm going to give you something that will make you sleep now." To my surprised relief, Erik accepted the draught without a murmur of protest, and within a few minutes his breathing had become even and his eyes closed wearily. Etienne closed up his bag and stared at the face on the cushion. Now that he was no longer hiding behind the barriers of his professional dignity, I could see the shocked pity and disbelief that had crept into his eyes. He reached out and took my hand absently. "I have never seen anything like this before," he said slowly. "This is not a simple case of disfigurement. It's almost as though—" He fell silent, groping for words and ideas that were just beyond the reach of his sharp mind, and I sensed the deep frustration of a man whose moment of inner vision confronts the insurmountable boundaries of existing language and knowledge. Lamarck defined two laws governing the ascent of life to higher stages. I heard him mutter to himself. "Is it possible that there could be another determining factor spontaneous alteration of a life form? His musings were beyond my comprehension, and after a moment he abandoned the vain struggle for expression and came to put his arms around me. I can't condone the behavior of the village, but at least I can understand it now. Madeleine, you can't possibly continue to keep him hidden away in this house. They'll never leave you in peace after this. For his own sake, you must permit me to put him in a place of safety. An institution? An asylum for the insane. I covered my face with my hands, but Etienne pulled them gently away and forced me to look at him. You must face the truth, my darling. You can't contain him any longer within these four walls. I have heard enough to know that he is already quite beyond your control. Rightly or wrongly, the village fears him. And whenever you try to take him, it will be the same. Hatred, persecution, violence. This time it was the dog. Next time it could be you. You have to think about your own safety, your own sanity. Sanity? I whispered uneasily. He shook his head gravely. Marie Parole came to me this evening. She was very worried about you, Madeleine. She begged me to come and see you. Why else do you think I would have come here without invitation? I tried to turn away from him, but he caught my arm. I won't stand by and see you driven out of your mind for the sake of a freak accident of nature. I'm very sorry for the child, but there's nothing I can do for him except put him beyond the reach of the ignorant. Etienne, no. Listen to me. Just listen. Let me make the arrangements, and when it's done, we'll go away from here. Far away, no one knows you, to a place where you can begin to forget. I love you, Madeleine, and I know that you love me. There's no reason in the world why we should not make our life together once you are free of this monstrous burden. Erik stirred on the sofa with a drowsy moan. Can he hear us? I demanded anxiously. He'd be most astonished if he could. I gave him enough laudanum to make him sleep the clock around. Even so, I was uneasy. Picking up his bag and hat, I drew him out into the hall and closed the door, and once we were there, I handed him his belongings and asked him to go. Madeleine, he sighed, you haven't listened to a word I've said. Oh, yes, I've listened, I said sadly. I've listened, and I've understood, and I've made up my mind. If I did as you suggest, I know that I should only come to hate myself, and in time I should begin to hate you. Go away from Pocheville, Etienne. Go right away and forget you ever saw me. It's all you can do now, because I won't abandon my child, not even for you. He looked at me with despair. The midwife had no right to let him live, he said darkly. If I had attended his birth, he never would have drawn a single breath. I smiled faintly and touched his hand. You would not have done that, Etienne. You would have saved him then just as you have saved him now. You are a good Catholic. But I'm a bad doctor, he said grimly. Bad doctor and a very great fool. I said nothing. He put on his hat with dignity and opened the front door. I'm going back to Paris at the end of the month, he told me steadily. If you change your mind in the meantime, you know where to find me. I won't change my mind. He reached out and touched my cheek gently. No, he said sadly. I know that you won't. A moment more he looked at me with regret, and then he was gone, striding away down the path between the swaying beech trees without a backward glance. There were tears in my eyes as I locked the door, but my movements had a new purpose and steadiness. I was no longer operating like a sleepwalker in a trance. The dream was gone. I was awake now. Returning to the drawing room, I covered Erik with a blanket. He did not move, and I judged him to be deeply asleep. A strange calm came over me as I looked down on him, a curious sense of resignation. For the first time since his birth, I felt at peace with myself. I lifted the figure of the shepherd boy from the chair where I had dropped it in the panic of the moment and placed it, without emotion, upon the mantelpiece, where it belonged. It had no power to move me now. I was no longer its mindless slave. I had only one child, whose mind I had warped and twisted, whose affection I had spurned, and whose heart I had repeatedly broken. But I did not want him dead, and I did not want him shut away. I did not want these things because I loved him more than Etienne, and now at last more than myself. When I looked in the mirror of my room, I no longer saw a spoiled, inadequate child, brooding bitterly on the cruelty of her fate. For the first time I saw a grown woman in her place. It could not be too late to repair the harm that I had done. I would not let it be too late. Tomorrow, while he watched, I would gather all the masks together and throw them on the fire. The sun woke me, stealing over my face like a warm caress. Sitting up with a start, I glanced at the clock and saw with concern that it was already late morning. I had tumbled into bed the night before, like a spent swimmer who has struggled to a far-off shore, and slept like the dead for almost 12 hours. Flinging a wrapper around my shoulders, I hurried downstairs to the drawing room, where the heavy curtains were still closed. Even in the dim gloom, I saw at once that the room was empty. "Erik?" My voice echoed eerily in the gloomy silence, and my slippered footsteps seemed unnaturally loud as I ran back up the stairs. "Erik, where are you?" When I threw open the door of his room, shafts of harsh, brilliant light struck me full in the face and forced me to shield my dazzled eyes with a gasp. It was a few moments before I was able to focus on the source of these cruel rays, and then I saw that his odd collection of mirrors had been set out at angles around the broken remains of the shepherd boy, to reflect a maze of macabre images that took my breath away with shock. I knelt in the sunlight beside the high altar of a child's imagination and stared dumbly at a message so plain, so unequivocal, that it might have been written across the glass in blood. I could see now that the figure had not been smashed in anger, but carefully severed by a glass cutter with a ritual precision that left the head and limbs recognizably intact. I was looking at the remains of an execution, staring down upon a dismembered body that asked nothing more of me in this world except burial. I continued to kneel on the floor, surrounded by his few treasures: my father's architectural library, a cupboard full of musical scores, a chest stuffed with a weird collection of magical devices. The violin that I had given him when he was 3 lay abandoned and forgotten at the foot of his bed. I could see that he had taken nothing with him in his headlong flight from the house, and I knew, without looking, that my purse remained untouched on the chest of the drawers in my room. This grim gesture of child sacrifice showed me every painful thought which had led him to this final act of despair. I had given him life, but now he chose to take no more from me. And in the tomb-like silence of the sunlit room, his last unspoken words rang in my ears, like the tolling of a passing bell. Forget me. End of Part 1. Part 2. Erik, 1840 to 1843. I remember it was pitch black the night I ran away from my home in Boischerville. There was no moon, and I was pushed through the dense undergrowth in the birch and pine forest of LLUMINA. Clumps of nettles stung my hands. I wasn't usually so clumsy, but tonight my head was clouded with a haze of laudanum, and I stumbled and fell several times. The wound beneath my ribcage had begun to bleed again with the exertion, and I was aware of a warm thickness seeping once more beneath my shirt, but I did not stop. I only pushed on and on, as though my life departed on this headlong, desperate flight, without knowing how or whither I fled. I was not afraid of the dark any more. I had long since learned to love the kindly veil that shielded me from hating eyes. I had become a creature of the night, passing unseen through the darker shadows of the woods, absorbing the wonderful mysteries of nature, while those who loved harsh daylight slept easy and ignorant in their beds. I was as nocturnal as a badger, and like a badger, I knew my only enemy was man. There was no plan, no coherent thought in my head, just a deep instinctive need to get away, far, far away from my mother's house. Sasha's death had showed me that my mother would never be safe while I continued to lie beneath her roof. As I lay half drugged on the sofa, I realized that there were only two alternatives open to me. I could let them shut me away in that terrible place for mad people, or I could run away. I chose to run. When the dawn came, I found a stream where I could drink, and built myself a shelter of branches and frosted leaves. It was no poetical advice, hardly the work of a great architect, but it shut out the knifing winds of that freezing Norman spring. When it was finished, I crept inside and lay there through several risings and settings of the sun. I was exhausted enough to have slept through the pain of my body. It was the pain of my mind that kept me awake, the pain of words which cut deeper than any mental blade. Freak of nature, monstrous burden, a place where you can forget. I thought of my mother. A dreadful clarity of vision showed me her relief at finding me gone, and I pictured Dr. Barret consoling her in his eminently insatiable, sensible, and practical fashion, while privately congratulating himself on this astonishing piece of good fortune. She was free now. We would go away together to a place where no one knew her, where she could forget me and be happy. I wanted her to be happy. She was so beautiful when she smiled at the statue of the shepherd boy. That was why I made it sing for her, so that she would be happy, and smile and not want to send me away to the asylum. I never meant to make her mad. When she first began to rock the empty cradle in the attic bedroom, I was afraid that she too might be sent to the terrible place of which she had told me. So I made everyone else go away instead. Father Mansois, Dr. Barret, Mademoiselle Perrault, I made them all disappear, one by one. I can make anything disappear, if I really want to. Anything, except my face. Even in my earliest memories, my mother was always cold and remote, like a beautiful distant star, always beyond my reach. I think I was born knowing that I must not touch her, but it was a long time before I understood the reason for her revulsion and hatred. Even when she dragged me in front of that mirror and showed me my face, I did not at first understand. I thought the horrendous thing in the glass was some nightmare creature sent to punish me for my disobedience, and for a long time I was afraid to remove the mask in case it came back to haunt me. The truth came to me slowly, and with the dawn of realization I developed an irrational fascination for mirrors. As I began to play with the cruel, feeling pieces of glass, I learned that they could be warped and manipulated, made to show to others an illusion of the sort of nightmare they showed me. My preoccupation with illusion made my mother angry. She said it was a sick fancy that if I did not conquer it and turn my thoughts to God, I would most certainly end as a madman. I was always being told to turn my thoughts to God, as though I were some especially wicked creature with more than one mortal's fair share of original sin. In point of fact, I was perfectly devoted and dutiful little Catholic, until the day I learned that animals have no souls. I have no memory of what took place once that dreadful revelation had been made to me. I do not know what I did to make Father Mansour decide I must be exorcised. It must have been something bad. I only know that after the grim ceremony took place, I discovered that I hated the priest, and I hated God too. God, who denied me an afterlife to my only friend. Why should hateful man have souls when my precious Sasha was condemned to be eaten by worms, returned to the clay as though she had never existed? I could not bear to be told that when we parted it would be forever. Sasha. As far back as I remembered, she had always been there, a warm, comfortable, welcoming presence who never turned from me. She looked upon my face without its mask and licked my bare cheek with her rough pink tongue. She let me kiss her smooth, soft head, and sometimes when I was working, she would push her nose into my hand and demand to be caressed. When I looked at her lying at my feet, with her beautiful golden fur all matted with dirt, I swore to be revenged upon the whole human race for this crime that my faith considered unworthy of the confessional. I learned how to hate the night that Sasha died. It was the first time I felt the mindless lust for blood, the uncontrollable, insatiable urge to kill, and kill, and kill. The first time, but not the last. It was bitterly cold beneath the bed of leaves, and my trembling breath left little clouds in the damp air. In the stiff, whitened grass beside my bed, I noticed a spider weaving its purple away. Mademoiselle Perrault was afraid of spiders. I had put one on her shawl once, a particularly large and ugly specimen, not unlike the one I saw now, and her scream of fright had been awesome to hear. My mother was not afraid of spiders, but she hated them all the same. She hated all ugly, unlovely creatures. Whenever I saw a spider in the house, I would rescue it before she got the chance to squash it with her broom. Sometimes I used to dream I was a spider, scuttling in a terrified search for some safe dark hole where no hating human could find me. I used to dream of spinning a great sticky web that would swallow all the people who threw stones through our windows and shouted ugly things. In the dark, I would slip out of a long thread of silk and gloat over their helplessness, before paralyzing them with one single bite. I have often thought that I would have been quite happy as a spider. Even a spider has a right to a mate. Hunger drove me at length from my shelter, forcing me to push on through the densely wooded area, walking by night and sleeping by day. And I won a queer fate had blessed me with some astonishing powers of recovery, and the knife wound was now healing to be a crusted brown wheal, which encouraged me to discard Dr. Bray's bandages. His prompt treatment had prevented infection. He had probably saved my life, but I did not see this as a thing I should be grateful for. Indeed, there were times when I came to hate him more for that single act of pity than anything else. I was vaguely aware that the forest would bring me out on the road to Canteleu. My instinct was to hide from people, but challenged by my growing need for food, that instinct was beginning to grow weaker every day. My clothes were torn and filthy, clinging to me like damp rags after so many nights spent sleeping on the ground, but that discomfort was lost beside my ravening hunger. I was not accustomed to hunger. In her half-crazed insistence that I should eat and not remind her of a starving skeleton, my mother had constantly set before me an obscene procession of dishes. Food was forced upon me like a punishment. It was as though she had sought to atone for some past neglect in this respect that filled her with perpetual guilt. I had developed sleight of hand at a very early age, simply a means of convincing this unwanted food to Sasha beneath her table, and I often thought of heaven as a place where no one would need to eat again, but that was before I truly understood what it meant to starve. I had had nothing but water for nearly a week, and I was lightheaded with desperation that was driving me steadily back into the inhabited world. The darkness fell once more. I left the shelter of the forest and ventured out onto the open road, where a blaze of winking lights beckoned welcomely. Lights meant people, and where there were people, there was also food that might be stolen. I stumbled on until I reached an encampment of tents and caravans, pitched on a broad patch of common land and backed by the deeper mass of the forest. Gypsies. I knew very little about these mysterious people, and what little I knew was mostly bad, gleaned from snippets of conversation between my mother and Mademoiselle Perrault. They were heathen masses. According to my mother, that was the worst crime imaginable. They stole children, particularly children who did not eat their supper, this last with a hard look at me. They were vagabonds, unwashed and unprincipled ruffians who should never be permitted to settle near decent folk. Gypsies were like spiders then. My mother did not like them, and I, in consequence, felt a sneaking comradeship with such social outcasts. Even so, I was wary and fearful of the discovery as I crept into the camp. A group of horses had been tethered to a post on the inner ring of the settlement, and their warmth and beauty momentarily swayed my purpose. I reached up instinctively to caress one smooth, velvety nose, and that was my undoing, for the horse whickered nervously at my unfamiliar touch, and at once a restlessness passed through the peaceful, tethered animals. Instantly a dog began to bark, and a man's voice cried out in an angry warning that someone was meddling with the horses. Suddenly, lanterns came at me from all sides. Instinctively, I dropped to the ground and hid my face with my arms, bracing myself against anticipated blows. I was grabbed by the shoulders and dragged along the frosted leaf-molded floor to the enormous campfire which flickered and flared against the clear spring night. And there I was flung at the feet of a small man with a jet-black mustache and a single gold ring dangling from one ear, who prodded me ungently with his foot. "Get up," he commanded coolly. I scrambled to my feet and looked around frantically for some avenue of escape, but I quickly saw that I was surrounded. "Do you know what we do with thieves?" the man demanded. "Little thieves who won't show their thieving faces. We roast them like hedgehogs." And then he leaned forward and pulled me close to his swarthy skinned face. "And then we eat them." I saw no reason to disbelieve this threat, and my gasp of horror was greeted with loud bells of delight laughter. "You better show your face then, hadn't you?" continued the man calmly, "if you don't want to finish on the campfire." I clutched hold of the mask in defiant terror, aware of this curious anticipation on every face that was rosy-hued with firelight. "Oh, let him go," said a woman in gaudy-colored skirts. "Poor little devil looks as though he's starving. Look at his arms. They're like sticks. Give him some food and let him go. He's not done any harm after all." "How do you know he's not done any harm?" I heard a man shout behind me. "We don't trust Gurgois, do we? Sneaking Gurgois. What was he doing hanging around the horses? I say, turn out his pockets and see what he's stolen first. And take off the mask. Yes, take off the mask." The cry was taken up like a chant, and I was passed around the fire from one set of hands to another, struggling all the time to hold on to the mask. "Take off the mask, dearie, and let's have a look at you." Fingers were fumbling at my temples and began to scream and kick out wildly. "No, no, please don't. Please. Listen to that. A gentleman's manners, if you don't mind. Is he a Bourbon prince who missed the tumbril?" The laughter was growing louder and wilder all around me. "Got blue blood, have you, dearie? Shall we open a vein and find out?" My arms were pinned behind me, and I strained violently to free myself. A strong hand came down beneath my chin and tore the mask away, and suddenly there was a deathly hush broken only by a single Romany oath. In the terrible silence I saw them all staring at me, on their faces a mixture of expressions ranging through utter disbelief to fear. "Let me go," I whispered faintly. "If you'll let me go, I promise I won't come back." They were closing in around me like wolves in a pack. I saw the flash of a knife in the firelight, and I screamed, for suddenly knew that it was all to be endured again, the mindless violence of an angry, unreasoning mob. Then everything went black, and I knew no more of what they did to me that night. It was morning when I awoke to find myself lying on a pile of sacking, and the first thing I did was to grope instinctively for the mask. It was nowhere to hand, and I sat up dizzily, reaching out farther and farther until I drew back at the touch of a metal bar. It was some time before I could focus clearly, and then I saw that there were bars all around me. I was in a cage. Trembling with fear and bewilderment, I lay back on the rags and shut my eyes tightly. I was so completely disoriented that it was easy to persuade myself that what I had seen was just a product of a fever dream. I would wake up soon to find myself back in the attic bedroom, with Sasha lying at my feet. I waited to wake up, and while I waited, I touched my swollen lips with the tip of my dry tongue and tried to call out, "Sasha." "Quick!" said a voice behind me. "Run and fetch Javert. He told us to fetch him as soon as it was awake." "Oh, what's the hurry? Let's have some fun with it first. Here, get a hold of this stick. Go on, get a hold of it. What are you scared of? It can't get out." "It!" I lay very still, willing this nightmare away. It was only a dream, only a bad dream that would end. When the sharp pierce of wood splintered against my forehead, sending a shower of prickling specks into my eyes, I tried to crawl out of their reach, but they simply pursued me to the other side of the cage. I could see now that there were 3 of them. 2 thin, olive-skinned gypsy boys with black hair and dirty faces, and a little girl in a torn dress who hung back and began to cry. "Don't, Mia. Don't hurt it like that." "Oh, shut up, Olga. I'll put you in the cage with it. Come on, Vaya. Let's find some stones." A huge shadow fell across the floor of the small cage, and I heard the crack of a whip. Without waiting to be told, the children fled across my cage was unlocked. I turned to look up at my new master. My first impression was one of size, immense size. He seemed to fill the entire cage, an enormous man with a great paunch of a belly, which hung grotesquely over his tight belt. He bore no resemblance to any of the small, slender, rather graceful men I had seen around the campfire that night before. He did not look like a gypsy, but looked every inch a rogue. His eyes, sunk in a fat face which glistened with sweat, even on this cold spring morning, were narrow and infinitely cruel as they rolled over me in a critical fashion. "Remarkable," he mused to himself. "I've waited all my life to find something like this. Something truly unique. They'll come from miles around to see a living corpse. Yes, that's it. That's what I'll call you, the living corpse." I backed away from him against the bars of my cage and slumped down in a crumpled heap against the cold metal rods. "I have to go home now," I said stupidly. "My mother will be looking for me." "The devil she will," he sniggered. "Have your little coffin all made up for you, will she?" "Coffin?" I stared at him without comprehension. "That's where corpses sleep, isn't it?" he replied obligingly. "Now there's an idea. I'll have a coffin made for the cage. No harm in heightening the effect with a prop or 2. And with that, he locked the cage once more and left me staring after him with dull stupefaction. My mind was quite blank, as empty as a worm's, a numb, frozen mass that flatly refused to perform the simplest feat of reasoning. I could not understand any of those few words that had been spoken to me in my native French. Might as well have spoken Russian. I did not understand why I was in the cage, or what was going to happen to me. But I had sensed sufficient threat from the man's manner to be thrown into a mindless panic. I began to claw frantically at the lock. In other circumstances, with a calm, rational brain and a single hairpin, I could have freed myself in minutes, but there was nothing in the cage to have served my purpose, even if I had the presence of mind to look. That single clumsy lock had the power to reduce me to total impotence. I hit and bit it like a wild animal, and not once, in all the time that followed, did I ever return to attack it with the full force of my intellect and my extraordinary manual dexterity. Even after all these years, I am still unable to explain that strange mental paralysis, except to acknowledge that the mind is capable of erecting barriers far stronger than any physical fence. Such is the key to all illusion. God knows it was a key I learned to turn often enough on others. For me at the moment, the illusion of capacity was so complete that even Had he left the door unbarred, I sometimes wonder whether I should not have still sat there, staring through the bars like a hopeless chained animal who knows no better than to wait patiently and endure. I lay back on the pile of sacking and watched the pale sun sink into a dim glow behind the forest. Children came back with their sticks, but I fear they found me poor sport. For this time I made no attempt to escape from their tormenting. I let them draw blood with indifference, almost without feeling, and receiving no response, they soon grew bored and drifted away to a more lively entertainments. At dusk the man called Javert returned and pushed a tin platter of disgusting stew and a patched blanket through the bars of the cage. I sat up hopefully. "Please, sir, may I go home now?" I whispered. I was like a very small child, repeating the only phrase in its repertory, and when I continued to repeat it day and night, you grew angry and struck me. "Can't you say anything else, you stupid creature? I'm fairly sick of your whining bleat. Now get this into your abdominal brain, if you have a brain at all, which I'm seriously beginning to doubt. You're my discovery, my creation, and my fortune. They tell me you won't eat. Well, I've trained too many animals to fall for that old trick. You'll eat of your own accord, or I'll force every mouthful down your ugly little throat by hand. You're not going home, and you're going to die on me either. Have you got that, you witless little monster? You'll do as you're told, or you'll suffer for it. Understand me? Now pick up the bread and eat it. Eat, goddamn you!" He caught hold of my head and began to force the rough, grainy bread into my mouth until I gagged and retched. But strangely, instead of angering him further, that merely served to make him very calm and coldly determined. "Very clever," he said quietly. "But if you think that's going to stop me, you're much mistaken. I'm a very patient man, though you might not think it. I could sit here all day, and if need be all night. So it's up to you, little corpse. It's entirely up to you how long you want to go on being stubborn." I do not know how long this torture lasted. It seemed like hours. Stars were winking in the sky, and as he was as soiled and stinking as the floor of my cage, before I reached the limit of my endurance and capitulated to his physical strength and his unwavering determination. When I finally took the piece of bread from his hand and began to nibble it wearily, he stood up, wiped his hands on my sacking bed. "I like an animal that knows its master," he said with satisfaction. "There's never been one yet that defeated old Javert." When he came to me the next day, I did not make the mistake of refusing to eat or asking to go home, but instead, what he intended to do with me. He seemed surprised by my question. "I'm going to exhibit you, of course. Why else would I do with you? People pay well to see freaks. Don't you know that? Don't you know anything about this world?" I stared at him in horrible disbelief. They will pay," I stammered. "Pay to look at me?" "Of course. And pay handsomely, too. In a few weeks' time, when word gets around about my new attraction, they'll be queuing all around this cage as far back as you can see." A flood of revolution swept over me, and I started to shiver and vomit uncontrollably. "Damn it!" he said irritably. "Greatest find in the world, and what does it turn out to be? A puking brat. Just my luck." Storming out of the cage, he hailed a passing child, who immediately began to cower with fear. "You, fetch me some milk, and look sharp about it. Move." He turned to glower through the bars at me. "And you'd better keep that down, you little skeleton, or I'll beat you senseless." I did not answer. I knelt on the floor and began to pray silently that God would let me die before this terrible new shame was forced upon me. I began my life as a freak exhibit, with my hands and feet bound to the bars of the cage so that I could not hide my face from the prying multitude. The first appearance had been a disaster that produced something dangerously close to a riot when the angry crowd demanded their money back. They could see nothing because I cowered in a corner with my arms wrapped around my head. They insisted that they had been cheated, and Javert, fearful of impending violence, promptly sent 2 men into the cage to bind me. I screamed and kicked and bit like a wild animal, but I was no match for the strength of 2 full-grown men, and within a few moments I was secured with my arms at full stretch, Christ on the cross. so that it was impossible for me to turn my face from view. Javert entered the cage and tied a rope around my neck so that I was forced to lift my head from my chest. As my skull jerked back against the iron bar, I opened my eyes involuntarily and saw people stepping back in delighted horror. "Mother of God!" exclaimed a woman, pulling a screaming child into the shelter of her skirts. "Let us pass. For pity's sake, let us pass through." The crowd parted a little to allow her to drag the hysterical infant away, but other children had also begun to scream, and I could not take my eyes from their open, shrieking mouths. It was as though I saw myself once more in that mirror and shared with them all over again the horror of first sight. But no horror could compare with the burning degradation, the unspeakable humiliation of this obscene exposure. Panic numbed all other senses, and I began to twist and pull like a frantic, unbroken horse until the rope cut into my throat. "Look!" someone shouted. "It's going to strangle itself." How disgusting! Such things should not be shown in public. A new ugliness was rapidly infecting the crowd. They had paid good coin to be titillated and entertained, not disturbed and discomforted. My raw anguish was offensive to some, and once more Javert was faced with angry demands to return the viewing fees. My cage was hastily withdrawn from view. I do not know how much money I cost him on that occasion, but it was sufficient to bring him to me a little later in the towering cage. He whipped me savagely for ruining his exposition. At the very moment when he blessed unconsciousness promised to embrace me, he cut me down from the bars and stood over me with his arms aggressively folded. "Well," he demanded coldly, "have you learned how to be silent now? Or do you need a further course of instruction?" I lay at his feet, staring in disbelief at the huge wheels that were rising on my bare arms. My head spun, and there was blood in my mouth from where I had bitten my tongue. But there was only one thought in my head. Only one desire. "Give me back the mask," I whispered. "What?" He stared at me curiously. "The mask," I repeated dizzily. "Give me back the mask, please." Suddenly, without warning, Javert began to laugh, slapping his whip against his gross thigh and then leaning toward to poke me with the crop. "Now you listen to me, little corpse, and listen good. No one's going to pay to see a bloody mask, but half the women in France will swoon at the sight of your face. Don Juan himself could not have drawn more skirts in one afternoon. But I won't have any more of that cursed screaming, so be warned. You drive away any more customers as you did today, and it'll be bad lookout for you. I'll flay every scrap of skin off your miserable body if you ever behave like that again in public." I clenched my fist and stared up at him in a crazy defiance. "I won't be seen. I won't be stared at. I won't. Surely he would kill me now. He would bring down his great fist and smash my suicidal impudence to a pulp. I waited desperately for the end that would release me, but he did not strike me again. Instead, he regarded me thoughtfully, as though he measured every lesion on my body and waited against the time when I could be exhibited once more. "I suppose I could always gag you," he mused slowly to himself. "It's the screaming that does the harm, makes the woman jumpy and spooks the crowd. Yes, I think I'll gag you next time. A beating soon forgotten, but a gag will put an end to your defiance once and for all." Next day we moved on. I did not know where we were going, nor did I care. Time and place had ceased to have any meaning to me, but he kept his promise. Next time I was exhibited, I was gagged and bound in an upright coffin, in a position where it was physically impossible for me to do myself harm. I was silent now, and this time no one complained or wanted their money back. It was an enormous success. Javert told me with satisfaction. When he came that night to feed me like a trained dog. When I had learned to be sensible, he would remove the gag and permit me to earn my keep with a little more comfort. I watched him put the key to the lock in his pocket, and walked away whistling cheerfully, and I thought how much I hated him, how much I wished that he were dead. The wind whistled around the bars of my cage that night as I lay listening to the camp dogs barking intermittently and hating. Hating! But hating could not keep me warm. Long before the campfires burned out, I laid the coffin flat on the floor, crept back inside its narrowness for shelter, and fell asleep. The gag defeated me, as Javert had known it must. His violence and cruelty concealed an innate shrewdness, a crude, instinctive sort of wisdom that showed him new and more suitable ways to conquer rebellion. It wasn't long before I came to accept that I was only adding to my suffering by my own stubbornness. Though my flesh still crawled with revolution when the crowds pressed around my cage, I learned to display the silent indifference of a dumb animal. That was what they wanted, what they came to see. An animal, an oddity, a thing. Increasingly, I ceased to feel that I belonged to what is loosely termed the human race. It was as though I had tumbled onto some alien planet, where I found myself unable to take revenge upon my tormentors, except in the dark prison of my mind. There, in that uniquely private domain, where I was free of chains, I conjured 1,000 horrible deaths for those who came to prod and stare. I learned to live almost entirely in my mind, creating a landscape of my own and peopling it with the devices of my captive imagination. My world was strange and beautiful, an entirely new dimension where music and magic held away. This way, it was a second Eden, where I alone was God, and at times I retreated so far into it that I became indeed a living corpse, comatose and trance-like, scarcely breathing. And yet, however far I retreated, there was always a part of me that remained bitterly aware of reality. My mobile prison jolted me across the length and breadth of France, from one fair to another, and I was kept in conditions of animal squalor until I feigned sufficient obedience and resignation to suggest that my spirit was entirely broken. Humility was the price of those moments of privacy which basic human dignity demands. My mother had taught me to conduct myself like a gentleman, to be fastidious in my person and courteous in my demeanor. I could not bear to live like an animal. I begged to be allowed out of my cage to attend to matters that demanded privacy, and this request so amused Javert, that mannerless pig, he came to release me in person and stand guard over my ambulations with his pistol. I knew that if I made any attempt to escape, he would shoot, not to kill. I was too valuable an exhibit for that, but to maim sufficiently to ensure I would not get far before he caught me. When I demanded clean clothes, he laughed out loud and told me he would never known a corpse so particular about his shroud. "You'll be wanting a dress suit next," he sneered. "Quit your bleating. You draw good enough crowds as you are." I turned very slowly to look at him. "I could draw more," I said, driven by desperation to sudden boldness. "I could draw twice as many people, if you made it worth my while." He lowered his pistol and beckoned me near. His instinct was to mock, but his own inherent greed made him curious. "What blather is this?" he demanded cautiously. "You're the most ugly creature that ever walked God's earth. That's your livelihood, and my good fortune. Why else would anyone want to pay to see you?" "If you'll place lilies in the coffin with me," I said slowly, "I could make them sing." He pushed the pistol into his belt and rocked to and fro on his heels, bellowing with laughter. "God help me, Brat, you're a raving lunatic. You'll be the death of me, I swear it. Going to make lilies sing, are you? And just how are you going to do that? I'd like to know." At this time, before I turned my attention to my own setting, I still considered Bach's Mass in B minor to be the worthiest interpretation of the Latin text. It was from the composition that so beloved of Father Monsieur, and that I now chose the Agnus Dei, which apparently issued from the petals of a wild daffodil beside Javert's boot. Agnus Dei Misera Nobis. Without emotion, I watched Javert's fat face sag in disbelief. As he bent and plucked the flower at his feet, he held it to his ear, and I heard his sharp gasp of astonishment when I let my voice ring sweetly in his head. He changed ears, and abruptly my voice changed direction. He threw the withered bloom to the floor and walked away from it, and I tapered the sound accordingly, so that it seemed to him my voice had grown distant. Then he came and stared at me intently, placing a thick, dirty finger on my throat, starting violently when he felt a faint vibration of my vocal cords. "How is this possible?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. I've seen enough ventriloquists in my time, but I've never heard anyone produce a voice like that. He caught me roughly by the shoulder and gave me an angry shake. I should beat you for keeping the secret from me, you little devil. When I think of the money I could have made already. He released me abruptly and stood back. Still, no matter you'll sing tonight, I'll get hold of those lilies if I have to raid a churchyard grave. Suddenly he became aware of my pointed silence. Well, he demanded uneasily. Why, that mum. Codfish look. Cat got your tongue, has it? I stared at him in defiant silence, and he immediately began to bluster like a bully who senses the first scent of defeat. All right. What's going on in that twisted little head of yours? Out with it. I shrugged my shoulders and turned away. If I agreed to sing, I told him calmly, there would be conditions. Conditions? He caught me by the neck and pressed his huge thumbs against my windpipe in a strangling grip. Conditions, is it? I could slit your throat for you here and now. Very slowly I began to smile, and I suppose the utter absurdity of his empty threat must have been instantly apparent to him, for even as he spoke it, he let me go, and I became aware that he was breathing noisily through his nose in a futile attempt to grover his fury. Conditions, he repeated, enunciating the word with some difficulty through clenched teeth. Well, what are these damned conditions? Name them, you insolent little bag of bones, and have done with it. I sat on the grass, staring away across the straggling camp with complete indifference to his growing agitation. I let him wait, and sweat. I won't sing without the mask, and I won't sing in a cage, I said steadily. If you want to make a bargain with me, you can begin by giving me my own tent. If I want, he began incredulously. Then suddenly he seemed to recover from this stupefaction and become coldly practical. Impossible, he continued, but without rage, I noted. How could I trust you to stay? I stared at the floor to hide the tears which were suddenly stinging my eyes, and I gazed squarely into the bleak future. I have nowhere to go. There was an edge of weariness and resignation in my voice. Give me privacy and a little comfort, and I will this day make your fortune return. He stared at me suspiciously. So you stay. Just supposing I chose to trust you. There's still the crowd to consider. They'll want to see your face. What's the point of the coffin and the lilies if they don't see your face? I considered this resentfully, for I knew he had made a valid point. Very well, I conceded at last. I agree to remove the mask at the end of my performance, but only for a few moments, just long enough to shock. My face remains covered until that moment, and the rest of the time is my own to do with I please. Don't want much, do you? There was a sneer in his voice, but something moved behind his hard eyes, a look that was almost a grudging sort of respect. I could beat you to a pulp, but I couldn't make you sing. That's it, little rogue. Isn't that what you're telling me? No, I told him grimly. You couldn't make me sing. We stared at each other like weary enemies, and after a moment he made an abrupt gesture for me to accompany him to his tent, striding off across the field and resisting the temptation to look back to check that I was following. For the moment, I was the victor. Strange as it may seem, once I had gained the small measure of my freedom, I no longer occupied myself with thoughts of escape. All my life I had been sheltered from the outside world, and I was yet to be ignorant of its ways to survive alone. I wished to eat reasonable intervals and have a roof of sorts over my head. Javert provided the basic necessities of life, and I chose to remain obediently at his side, for much the same of life I had chosen to remain obediently, for to the same reasons that tie a stray dog to a cruel master. His authority was the boundary of my word at a time when I still had child enough to need such boundaries and a sense of order and place that they bestowed. I belonged to him, perhaps for no better reason than that I simply needed to belong. Moving became an integral part of my life. and I quickly learned to embrace the instinctive restlessness of the gypsies and absorb their mystical ways. I soon recognized the sign that other Romany travelers had left in their wake, signs that pass unnoticed to the eyes of the uninitiated. A birch twig denoted danger ahead, white feathers, the presence of chickens in the area. Branches of fir announced a wedding. Silent and observant, I soon became as steeped in Romany customs and skills as any gypsy born on the open road. Once it was discovered that my eyes were adapted to the dark better than any cat's, I was immediately singled out for the ancient practice of shaving drab. In the tent of a gap-toothed old woman, famed for her herbal knowledge, I was taught how to prepare a poison capable of killing a pig without contaminating its blood. And then, at dead of night, I would be sent creeping into a nearby farm to administer this poison to some unfortunate beast. Most gypsies will not thieve at night for fear of encountering the spirits of the dead. But as Javert pointed out with a drunken wit, the dead were hardly likely to object to my presence. Next morning, when the farmer was puzzling over the mysterious demise of his pig, one of the tribe would appear at his door begging for food. Almost invariably they would be presented with the carcass, the farmer being anxious to get it off his hands, fearful lest the death herald some deadly outbreak of disease. I hated this practice and never ate meat procured in this manner. It became known as one of my eccentric ways that I would go hungry rather than share in such a meal, and eventually, as the performances in my tent grew steadily more professional and lucrative, I refused to undertake this distasteful task any more. The night that I threw the vial of Drio on the campfire and told the tribe to procure their own miserable carrion in future was a strange turning point. No one moved to punish me. No one struck me to the ground for my disobedience. And it was then I suddenly came to realize I was not without power. Power! The concept began to appeal increasingly as I perfected my ventriloquist skills and sat long into the night devising increasingly complex magical tricks to enchant the crowds. By the time I had passed 2 summers with the gypsies, my fame was already beginning to run before me, and the camp was growing unusually prosperous as a result. I was the main attraction at every fair. People came for miles to see me perform. And though I still hated the moment of unmasking, there was a certain satisfaction in breathlessness, and the breathless hush which greeted my singing and my displays of legerdemain. Power! Once I had begun to seek it actively, power came to me in many curious and unexpected ways. My period of instruction in the wise woman's tent had sparked an acute interest in the herbal properties she sold all the summer fairs. She had remedies for every conceivable human disorder, and since anything that caused the human race to suffer was inevitably of consuming fascination to me, I began to study her skills with stealthy industry. She was ugly enough herself to be largely untroubled by my presence, and I think she was flattered by my questions. But when I began to experiment with tried and trusted remedies, she was furious and threatened to put a curse upon me. I think that would have been the end of my tuition. But that same night, she was stricken with a fever that yielded to none of her proven recipes. The rumor went around the camp that she was dying of a deadly contagion, and with cold and pitiless logic the tribe repitched their tents at a safer distance. Surely someone will go to her, I protested uneasily. Javert looked up in a mild surprise from the stick he was patiently whittling. Stick. There's nothing to be done for a mortal fever, he told me placidly. It's only common sense to keep away. A strange fury gripped me, a fury that owed virtually nothing to pity, but a great deal to mortal impotence and complacency. There was no better way to raise a demon in my brain than to tell me a thing could not be done. Impossibility was not a concept I acknowledged. I got up quietly, without breathing a word of my intention, and crossed the void to the old woman's tent. I could see as I looked at her that she was in a very bad way, and I felt the same frustration I had once experienced when I dismantled my mother's clocks. Unbelievable irritation in the face of my own inadequacy and limited competence. Well, I had learned very easily to master the mechanism of a clock, and I would not be defeated this time either. Not by some miserable pestilence invisible to the naked eye. I was not moved by any feeling of common humanity or affection. This was simply a challenge I could not resist. While the old woman lay moaning on her pallet, completely insensible of my presence, I pulled out the ancient copper pans and began to heat an infusion of my own. She lived. The infection spread all over camp, afflicting almost half of the sturdy gypsy children who had seldom known a day's illness in their lives. Those who were treated with the traditional infusions died. The 3 who were treated with mine lived. Beginner's luck, perhaps, but of such strange and timely coincidences, legends are born. After that incident, the tribe began to treat me with increasingly wary respect. The entire encampment, riddled with superstition, took to explaining my rapidly expanding skills as a natural talent for dealing with unseen forces. The story went around the campfire that I was the scholar of ancient gypsy legend, the 10th graduate of the College of Sorcery, who had been detained in payment to serve as the devil's apprentice. It was said that I knew all the secrets of nature and magic, and that I rode a dragon which dwelt high in the mountains of Hermanstedt and slept in the cauldron where thunder was brewed. The change in my status was remarkable. Small children no longer threw stones and chanted names when I appeared. If I passed by their tents in the daytime, they would run away from me as though I were the devil in person, shrieking for their mothers, who now knew my name as the ultimate threat to enforce obedience. Hush, or Erik will come and take you to his tent, and you will never be seen again. Boys of my own age, who had made my life a misery during my early months with the tribe, now left me alone, fearing a terrible retribution if they angered me. And since it was comfortable to be free of their torment, I did everything in my power to foster the growth of my grim reputation. Power! I was beginning to acquire quite a taste for it, to see it as a very satisfactory substitute for happiness, for love. By the time I had spent 3 summers with the gypsies, I was pleasantly aware that everyone in the camp regarded me with some degree of unfounded terror. Yes, everyone was afraid of me by then. Everyone except Javert. Legend though I might be, I was still his creature, and he never let me forget it for a moment. Javert was not a true-born Romany, not even a fosterat or half-breed. He was a Corridi, a wanderer tolerated purely for his skills as a showman, and I soon began to understand that. Though he traveled with the gypsies, he was no more a part of their tightly knit community than I was. At some point in his past, he had a nodding acquaintance with an education. Unlike the rest of the community, he could read, and from time to time, odd remnants of culture would suffice inexplicably through the layers of his inherent vulgarity. It was Javert who told me the legend of Don Juan and added the great lover's name to the odd collection of nicknames with which he delighted to address me. At first, it was just another insult, no more hurtful than anything else, but as I grew older and more aware of the meaning behind this mockery, I began to hate the name Don Juan more than any other. Javert was forever parting of lovers, and yet no woman ever came to his tent. Since he was no man's blood brother, there was no father in the camp who would have accepted a bride prince from him, and in my incoherent ignorance I simply assumed that this was the reason that he had no wife. He strode into my tent one evening without warning, as was his wont, and leaned over me, breathing vile spirit fumes into my face. I could see at once that he was drunk, and when he was drunk, he was dangerous. I knew I would have to take care. Working. Always working, he remarked unpleasantly, pushing a fat finger into the mechanism of a new device which lay on the table before me. What an industrious little corpse you are. When an unseen spring snapped shut on his finger, I received a blow to the head which tumbled me to the floor. Damn you, he snapped. You made that happen. I did not, I flared with indignation, since for once I was telling the truth. It was an accident. Yes, I dare say, he sneered. You're very good at arranging accidents, are you? I've noticed how many little misfortunes befall me when you're around. I was silent, wondering with alarm whether he could really have guessed how much mischief I was responsible for. That fall from his horse, for instance, the inexplicable collapse of his tent, silly, irritating, commonplace misfortunes that I had thought him incapable of connecting with me. I looked up into his face, saw with terror that he knew everything, and waited for the punishment to fall. I didn't have to wait long. Abruptly, he snatched the mask from my face, slashed it to pieces with his ugly knife, and flung the pieces at me. Then he stared at me. "No tears," he frowned. "You disappoint me, little corpse, and surely you know better by now than to disappoint old Javert." He reached out and struck me repeatedly across the face with the back of his huge hand, but I remained silent, staring at him with dried-eyed loathing. And at length, remembering that I was to perform that night, he abandoned his attempt to make me cry. "A man at least," he said begrudgingly. "No longer a snivelling brat. You'll be wanting a wage next, I suppose." I judged it safer to remain silent as he loomed over me. I had learned to distrust these moments of apparent generosity. They were usually the prelude to fresh violence or humiliation. "How old are you?" he demanded unexpectedly. "I don't know." I kept my eyes on the floor. "You don't know?" he sniggered suddenly. "Surely you have a date of birth like anyone else. Or perhaps you weren't born at all. Maybe you just hatched out of an egg like a lizard." A looking glass shattered in my memory and I shivered. "I don't know," I repeated shakily. "My... she... it was never spoken of." He passed the sleeve of his shirt across the nose and grinned, showing a row of yellow gapped teeth. "Well, I dare say there was nothing much to celebrate. It's a miracle no one dropped you on the fire before you drew a breath. But I'd say you must be 11 or 12 by now. That seem about right to you?" I nodded wearily, wondering where this strange line of questioning could be leading. "Well then," he continued affably, "another year or so, if you should keep drawing these crowds, I might see my way clear to paying you a wage, of course. It would depend on whether you continue to give satisfaction, on the stage and off, if you take my meaning. I like boys who know how to show their gratitude, in a manner of speaking." I stared at him blankly. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Don't worry, you will." He laughed and cuffed me playfully around the ear. "Yes, you'll understand. All in good time. You're very clever, I grant you that. A sight too clever for your own good at times, but you don't know everything. There's a thing or two that I can teach you when I mind to do it. And if you're willing to learn, if you're willing to please, well, you might find me very generous." I had no idea what he was talking about, but his tone and soft, almost feline manner made me cold with apprehension. This curious inability cloaked an unknown threat as yet beyond my comprehension. I was afraid to ask any more questions. I had the feeling that, for once, I did not want to know the answers. He sucked his bleeding finger, spat upon the earthen floor, and sauntered to the flap of the tent. In the doorway he turned to look back at me, and there was a strange expression on his face. "I never had a corpse before," he mused. And then he was gone, leaving me alone with my ignorance and my fear. I waited nervously during the following months for this nameless disaster to overtake me, but my life continued as before, and nothing worse befell me than the beatings which I was already familiar. I had learned to accept physical pain with a show of indifference. If my performance was not perfect, if I crossed my master with a casual, unconsidered word, I knew exactly what to expect. But my split skin and bruises healed quickly, and I was careful never to make a mistake more than once. I had learned how to survive. At some point during the following year, we crossed the boundary into Spain, traveling steadily into the direction of Catalonia. The annual fair at Verdú had been a traditional meeting place for gypsies since the 14th century, and an atmosphere of suppressed excitement permeated the camp at the prospect of emotional reunions with blood brothers. At night, the tents and wagons disorged their occupants around the campfire. The fiddlers struck up a merry refrain, and the gypsy girls danced for their menfolk. weaving in and out of the flickering light, trailing long scars over bare, sun-tanned arms. Graceful, sensual. This was the first time I had learned to love above all else, when the magic of the gypsies unfolded before my eyes as I lay a little distance away watching, listening, absorbing, its silent and unseen, like a snake in the dry grass. Their culture was a universe removed from the respectable middle-class existence I had known before, a life steeped in the love of music and governed by an instinctive, abiding respect for the forces of magic and mystery. To a gypsy, every stream, forest, and hedgerow is peopled by invisible sprites and demons that must be constantly appeased by incantations and charms. The occult holds a powerful grip and fortune is determined by the turn of a tarot card. I was fascinated by the secrets of divination and enthralled by their music, which opened up new vistas to my formerly trained ear. It was music that acknowledged no artificial boundaries, dispensing with chords, transition, and intermediate modulation. Its reading was utterly intoxicating. I listened and I learned, and all that I absorbed found expression in the secret world within my tent, in music or illusion. No part of me was untouched by their inspiration, but I did not acquire those heightened concepts of beauty and mystery without pain. I had been a solitary child, content with my own company, neither knowing nor desiring companions, but now I looked out upon a very different world. A world of gregarious, tightly woven people who were not forbidden by unspoken taboos to touch each other or be public in that touching. Every evening that I watched them together, fighting, laughing, loving, made the awareness of my own difference increasingly sharp and hurtful. It threw a cold new light on my inner misery. Perhaps, if I had not tumbled among gypsies, I should not have been made aware of the female form at such an early age. Perhaps I should have enjoyed a few more years of sexless, boyish innocence. Gypsy women are not light and lascivious in their ways. Virgins are highly valued and only to be bought for an accepted bride price. But love, when sanctified by marriage, was not a private thing, and couples embraced freely around the campfire, displaying their pleasure in one another's bodies without shame. That spring in Verdun, it seemed to me that the whole world was pairing off together, sharing a universal secret that would always be closed to me. Suddenly, it was not enough to be the devil's apprentice, the star turn of an increasingly famous traveling show. All I wanted was to be like everyone else. While the wedding celebrations were at their height, the fiddlers throbbing with that extraordinary love of life which is so peculiar to gypsies throughout the world, I slipped away into the black, shapeless night and stole what I needed from the wise woman's tent. I could live with cruelty and hatred. It was the happiness of others that I could no longer endure, the sudden realization that none of my talents was ever going to win me an acceptance as a human being. My tent might be comfortable now. I might be free to come and go as I pleased, but in all essentials, I still lived in a cage, surrounded by my invisible bars. The world wanted nothing from me except the gratification of the sensory organs of sight and sound. I was alone, and nothing was ever going to change that. Perhaps it was time to leave this world behind. The night was dry and still, silent except for the far-off throb of fiddles and the gentle whir of crickets in the tall grass. Enormous moths hurled themselves at my lantern and bounced off my mask. Enormous moths hurled themselves at my lantern and bounced off my mask as I fled away from the settlement, where the gypsies danced with growing wildness as liquor began to flow more freely and the flames of the campfire leapt up against the black Spanish sky. When I was certain no one could see me, I tore off the mask and threw it at the crescent moon which gleamed pale and uncaring upon my frenzy of grief. Then I sat upon the dusty road and examined the little bottle I had stolen from the wise woman's tent. It contained sufficient poison to kill the whole camp. I did not intend that there should be any mistake over the dosage. Unscrewing the little glass stopper and checking at the bitter aroma which emerged, I hesitated. The magic talisman of death was in my hand. My skeleton's hand. And all that prevented me from using it to escape from this nadir of despair was the sudden nagging relic of a memory I had thought long discarded. Father Mansoir's homily on the deadly sins of murder and suicide had been impressed on me at an age when most children are struggling to master the credo. Murder and suicide, he had told me grimly, were equal crimes in the eyes of the Lord, and brought an undiscriminating damnation upon the perpetrator. Suicide lies in an unhallowed grave, and the gates of heaven remain closed to him forever. Life is never ours to take, Erik. If you remember nothing else of what I have taught you, remember that. They were virtually his last words to me after the exorcism. I had stared through him, as though he did not exist, pretending I could not hear a word he said. But now, I remembered, and I gazed at the poison in my hand with horror. Suppose it was true that by the act I closed the door on one suffering merely to open another leading to one infinitely worse, and this time without a natural end. Appalled by the possibility, I flung the little bottle to the ground and watched the dry earth swallow up the liquid that trickled out. A sense of hopelessness washed over me as I bent mechanically to retrieve the mask, but before I could replace it, I was startled by a cry in the darkness behind me. I stopped and listened intently, and once more the voice wavered out in the darkness, this time on a low moan of pain. Moaning instinctively in the direction of the sound, I climbed to a rocky outcrop. Unfaltering and fearless with my cat's eyes and the peculiar agility which had once caused my mother to liken me to a monkey. On the other side of the rocks, the lantern showed me a crumpled heap of brightly colored skirts and a pretty face that was familiar to me from the campfire. "Dinchia," I whispered. She looked up at me and screamed with an ugly, piercing intensity that took me by shock surprise. I had forgotten for the moment that I was no longer wearing the mask. Her screams jangled every nerve in my body, and I was suddenly overcome with blind fury. "Stop it!" I snapped, shaking her wildly by her thin shoulders. "Stop that screaming, or else I'll do you all the harm you fear and more." That silenced her. She swallowed her screams with a sort of gulping sob and cowered back in my grasp, like a terrified rabbit in the jaws of a wild dog. I let go of her contemptuously. "Were you hurt?" I demanded with cold indifference. She was shaking violently, and her teeth were chattering with fright, but she managed to indicate her left foot, which I saw was twisted at an unnatural angle. "Will you let me look?" I said. She was too frightened to refuse. Over my gypsy garb I still wore the long magician's cloak that I affected for performances. Removing it, I tore a strip from the bottom and then wrapped the rest of the robe around her shoulders, for it was bitterly cold beneath the clear mid-April sky, and her skin was chill and moist with shock. I felt the broken bone in her ankle at the first probe of my finger and immobilized the joint the best I could. She fainted when I touched her, though. Whether from pain or sheer terror it was impossible to tell. I wasn't unduly concerned or surprised, and at any rate it made my task much easier. When I had finished, I sat down on a nearby rock and waited for her to come to her senses. The light of my lantern traced the curve of her breast, and thought came to me that I hastily pushed away in disgust. I did not touch her, and after a while the urgent desire to do so ebbed away, leaving me calm and cold once more, entirely in control of my body. The first adolescent stirring of desire was fierce but transient, and I felt curiously triumphant at having mastered it. I was suddenly quite warmly disposed to this girl who had made me feel that I had never felt the ravages of love. Lust, it was nothing special after all, simply a rush of blood, an animal instinct that I could contain and control just as successfully as I controlled my voice. This girl was pretty, but I did not love her. So perhaps God had been merciful after all, and not made me as other boys. Perhaps I would never love anyone. Elation and relief surged through me at the thought, and I wished that she would wake up so I could begin to thank her for this wonderful sense of release. Lust was nothing, and I did not love her. I did not love her, and I no longer felt the need to die of crushing misery. Everything was going to be all right after all. She opened her eyes upon my face and looked hastily away with a shudder. I have never seen you before without the mask, she whispered. Really? A little of my warm gratitude shriveled, and with it all desire to thank her. You must be the only person in the camp who has not, then. Perhaps I should charge you for the privilege of a private viewing. Fear returned to her eyes. I sighed and picked up the mask which lay beside me on the ground, replacing it with a gesture that had become second nature to me. You have nothing to fear, he said quietly. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to hurt anyone. But you said before, you said... Oh, that. I gave a little shrug of indifference. That was only those stupid women screaming and fainting around. That was only because you made me angry. I hate it when people scream at me. All those stupid women screaming and fainting around my cage. You can't imagine how much I hate it. She sat up a little, her eyes still wary upon me, but her breath coming with greater ease as the mindlessness of her terror abated. Everyone says that you're evil, that you work for the devil as in the princess and ride a dragon. I finished for her diversely. Do you honestly think I would stay with Javert if I had a dragon to ride? She smiled faintly. I suppose not. How strange it is to talk to you, just as if you were like anyone else. A sick cold wave passed over me, and I suddenly felt the horrible feeling I was going to cry. Just when I had thought I had done crying forever. A quiet, unthinking little comment completely shattered my composure and my newfound resignation. I am like everyone else, I burst out angrily. Inside, I am just like everyone else. Why should that seem so strange? She was silent, staring at me curiously, and I found I could no longer meet her gaze. She did not understand what I was telling her, but at least she was no longer afraid of me. I suppose that was something. What were you doing out here alone? I asked after a moment. Are you not at the wedding feast? Something passed across her face, a fleeting look of guilty defiance. That's none of your business, she said rather sharply. I stared at her in honest disbelief, for I suddenly saw that there could be only one explanation for her absence. You have been meeting a lover? I breathed in awe. A Gorgorio lover. She glared at me. And what if I have? Your father will beat you and drive you from the camp if he finds out, I said uneasily. I knew there was no worse crime a gypsy daughter could commit than to betray her proud race with a Gorgorio. Mixed blood was deeply frowned upon. When her angry bravado abruptly disappeared, and she burst into noisy tears, I did not know what to do. Where is your lover? I demanded uncomfortably. Why has he left you here alone? Is he coming back for you? Her face contorted with rage, and she beat her clenched fist on the hard ground. He promised to marry me. Spanish pig. He promised. Oh, they were right about Gorgorios. Filthy, lying Gorgorios. May the devil rot him. I hope his manhood shrivels up and drops off on his wedding night. I was glad that I was wearing the mask, for I knew I had turned furiously red with embarrassment. 3 years among the gypsies had not hardened me to their healthy, unashamed vulgarity. What are you staring at me like that for? She demanded with hostility. I wasn't staring. I was hastily apologetic. Not only was she no longer afraid of me, she now seemed to remember that she possessed at least 5 years' seniority. A cold of aloofness had crept into her voice, and I felt myself growing younger and more stupid by the minute beneath her contemptuous glance. They will come looking for you soon, I told her. They must not find you here. I leaned forward to give her my hand, but she recoiled in disgust. Don't touch me, she spat unexpectedly. If you touch me, I shall scream until the whole camp hears and comes to find us. I was stunned. We had conversed like human beings. Now suddenly I was an animal again. Then as I looked at her face in the light of the lantern, as I saw the sly secret smile of satisfaction cross her lips, I suddenly understood her purpose. No one will believe you, I gasped. No one will believe it was I who lured you to this place. Oh, you didn't lure me, she said simply. I was taken by force. In silence, I inquired with trembling sarcasm, without a single cry of protest. I fainted from terror. She was staring fixedly into the distance as though she were watching a play being acted out in front of her. Why would doubt the truth of that? No one, I admitted to myself with cold horror, no one would doubt her. I had cultivated a reputation for evil out of all proportion to my years. No one now was going to waste my time wondering whether I was too young to rape a pretty girl. I backed away from her, shaking my head, slow disbelief. Then panic overwhelmed me, and I fled back the way I had come. I was sobbing with rage when I reached my tent. Grabbing the few belongings I had accumulated over years, I rolled them into a sack. With a feverish desperation that seemed curiously at odds with my earlier mood of suicidal despair. When she told her tale, I knew that I would wear the dead man's shirt. Forgetting their individual fears, the entire camp would rise up against me to take revenge for such a violation. I was not afraid of death anymore, but I was still sufficiently a child to fear the protected torture that must precede it. They would do terrible things to me, indescribable things. I was so wrapped up in my own terror that I did not hear the footstep behind me until it was too late. A hand fell heavily on my shoulder. "Well, now," said a familiar voice in my ear. "What's all the haste? Leaving, are we? Leaving dear old Javert without so much as a by your leave?" He twisted me around to face him, digging his fingers into a point on my neck, which caused me paralyzing pain. The soft menace of his voice and narrow intensity of his gaze held me breathless with fear. "Leaving without a word of gratitude after all I've done for you," he continued thoughtfully. "Looked after you like my own flesh and blood, and now you'll up and off. Oh no, my dear, I don't think so. You don't escape from old Javert as easily as that." As his free hand ripped the buttons from my shirt, I gave a gasp of shock. The shameful, nameless horror that had been hovering above me like a breath of foul air had now descended so unexpectedly that I was powerless to struggle against his strength. As I watched him take off his belt, I knew instinctively that this was to be no simple beating. This was a terror as yet beyond my imagination. His hand slid caressingly down my body beneath the open shirt, and I shivered. "How cold you are," he complained. "As cold as the dead. Ice water running in your veins. But no matter, I shall warm you soon. Please." I jerked away from his hand, and he laughed as he forced me to the floor. I began to fight in earnest then, with a savage desperation I should not have employed simply for my life. "That's better," he said with strange satisfaction. "That's much better. You're surprisingly strong, aren't you? I see I could not have delayed this little lesson much longer. No one else would ever want you, as I do. Certainly no woman. Do you know that? Do you realize the great honor I'm about to bestow on you? No, of course you don't. Proper little innocent you are, for all the tales they tell about you around the campfire. Pure as driven snow in spite of all your clever tricks. Well, not for much longer. This, my dear, is the end of your innocence." He put one hot hand between my legs, and then I understood. I did not know how it would be possible, but deep inside I understood what was going to happen to me. Oh God, rape. Why had I thought that was a fate reserved exclusively for women? I stopped fighting, and lay perfectly still, watching him discard his dirty clothes on the floor beside me. "I see you've decided to be sensible," he remarked. "That's good. That's how I like it. A healthy struggle to whet the appetite, and then a little accommodation." "What must I do?" I whispered hollowly. "Take off your clothes and the mask, and then I'll show you." I sat up warily, controlling my senses. Panic. No sudden movement, nothing to cause him alarm. I saw him relax visibly at this evidence of my resignation. When he turned away carelessly to kick off his boots, my hand closed on the hilt of the knife that was protruding from beneath his discarded belt. I waited just long enough for him to turn back to me. Then I plunged the knife up into the obscene, wobbling mass of flesh which concealed his gut. I was shocked and thrilled by the extraordinary intensity of pleasure I felt that knife slide effortlessly between the layers of skin and bury itself up into the hilt. Shocked that I should register that extraordinary sensation preciously where his indecent hand had touched me. I watched Javert's eyes bulge in incredulous disbelief. His mouth sag and quiver on a soundless gasp. His hands clutched helplessly at the fountain of blood which spurted from him when I calmly removed the knife. I gazed at the crimson torrent with dispassionate, almost academic surprise. It was as though I had burst a skin of wine. There was time to wonder at this curious phenomenon. There seemed to be all the time in the world. He was on his feet, lurching desperately toward the flap of the tent, when I sank the knife into his ribs, this time striking jarringly against bone. His hands closed over mine, and I jerked the blade free. But his strength was draining rapidly away, and he could not hold me. I saw my arms free in an arc and brought the knife down for the final time, implanting it squarely in the sweating hollow of his throat. He fell like a stone at my feet. I stared down at this mutilated body with panting ecstasy and watched his jerking death throes without a flicker of remorse or revulsion. It had been so easy and so incredibly satisfying that I could hardly believe my good fortune. 5 minutes ago I had been an innocent, terrified child. Now I was a man with a remarkably efficient murder to my credit. I felt intoxicated with power as I whipped the knife clean on Javert's shirt and tucked it into the sack which lay on my pallet. Quietly and hurriedly, I gathered up the sack and made my way to his tent, where I quickly located a leather bag in which he kept the profits from my performances. There was nothing furtive or frightened about the manner in which I crossed the camp and calmly took my favorite horse from the tethered group. I no longer feared discovery. No man would lay a hand on me again and live to boast of it. I was leaving now because I chose to leave, and I left not in fear for my own safety, but in contempt for my past weaknesses. My childish terrors and my spineless despair. The end of innocence. I had outgrown the limitations of this pretty little tribe and wanderers. I no longer needed the dubious protection of a perverted villain. My childhood was at an end, and the world beckoned to my unique talents. I had only just begun to explore the vast empire of my mind. And now, its frontiers stretched ahead of me like a far horizon. I wanted to consume every note of music ever written, to absorb all the world's knowledge and master arts as yet conceived by humanity. I no longer needed boundaries. Wherever I found them in the future, I would tear them down, forging in my wake new wonders to astonish poor credulous mankind. Creation and destruction were the only lusts I would acknowledge henceforth. I would be like God, an absolute force beyond question, beyond restraint. The end of innocence. Like Adam, I had eaten of the tree of knowledge and been condemned in consequence to wander the face of the earth. But my Eden was full of cruel nettles and vicious thorns. I could not look back on its loss with any regret. The change of consciousness with which a Paris priest had sought to shackle me were broken now beyond repair. Losing the fear of death, I had lost a respect for the lives of others. Tonight, I had been made to see that life was cheap and easily spent, a poor cowering creature of the daytime that could be snuffed out as easily as a candle's light. Death was the ultimate power, and I, his eager, willing apprentice. Murder was only another art for me to master.